the coin toss between life and death. Sometimes fate does not require war, conspiracy, or an enemy. Sometimes the distance between life and death is no wider than a coin spinning in midair, heads or tails. A train or an airplane, returning to the arms of the person you love, or vanishing from this world forever. On the evening of the 16th of January, 1942, in Las Vegas, one of the most famous women in America, Carol Lombard, the highest paid actress in Hollywood, the queen of screwball comedy, and the wife of Clark Gable, stood before a decision that seemed small, yet would change history forever. Her mother and her husband's closest press agent both pleaded with her, nearly begged her to take the train back to Los Angeles. War was spreading across the American sky. Night flights had become dangerous. Accidents were happening more frequently. But Carol Lombard wanted to get home immediately, not out of convenience or exhaustion, but because a confrontation was waiting for her. A fractured marriage, a husband suspected of infidelity, and a truth she could not allow to pass for another day. The argument among the three grew tense. No one was willing to yield. And then, in a gesture that was both impulsive and deeply theatrical, perfectly true to Carol Lombard herself, she made a final proposal. A coin toss. Heads meant the plane. Tails meant the train. Carol had always believed she was lucky when she called heads. The coin struck the table. Heads. The decision was made. There was no turning back. Just 13 minutes after takeoff, the Douglas DC-3 of TWA Flight 3 slammed into a mountainside near the summit of Mount Potosi at nearly 185 miles per hour. All 22 people aboard were killed instantly. Among them were Carol Lombard, her mother, Elizabeth Peters, Clark Gable's representative, and 15 young U.S. Army pilots on their way to training facilities. There were no distress calls, no chance to correct the mistake. Only darkness, stone, and a fatal error in a compass. But to understand why Carol Lombard's death shocked the entire nation, why President Franklin D. Roosevelt called her the first woman to die in the defense of her country during World War II, and why Clark Gable would carry his wife's ruby earring with him on 5 combat missions over Nazi Germany, we must go back in time to a girl born into luxury, raised through rupture, and forged into the most dangerous woman in Hollywood comedy. Part 2, Born into Privilege, Forged by Loss. Jane Alice Peters was born on the 6th of October, 1908, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, into a world that should have guaranteed security for life. Her early years were surrounded by the quiet confidence of old money wealth that did not announce itself loudly, but moved silently through generations. Her father, Frederick Christian Peters, had built a successful fortune in the hardware business. Her mother, Elizabeth Bessie Knight Peters, came from one of Fort Wayne's most prominent families. Even further back, her lineage extended into the technological backbone of the modern world. Her grandfather had played a key role in financing the first transatlantic telegraph cable, a project that reshaped global communication. By every definition, Jane Alice Peters was born holding a winning hand. And then, just as quietly as that privilege had existed, it collapsed. In 1914, when Jane was still a child, her parents' marriage disintegrated. The separation did more than fracture a household, it dismantled an entire way of life. The wealth that once promised stability vanished with stunning speed. Elizabeth Peters, now a single mother with 3 children, made a decision that would define both her life and her daughter's. She left Indiana behind. With no husband, no financial safety net, and no guarantees, Elizabeth relocated her family to Los Angeles. It was a city still inventing itself, a place where ambition mattered more than pedigree, and survival depended on adaptability. This displacement did not produce a fragile or sheltered child. It produced a force. Jane Alice Peters did not grow into the delicate porcelain starlet Hollywood would later try to manufacture. She became a tomboy, ferociously physical, relentlessly competitive, and startlingly fearless. She ran faster than the boys. She jumped higher. She climbed trees, vaulted fences, and scraped her knees without apology. Her athleticism was not a hobby, it was a language. In a world where her security had been stripped away without warning, her body became her armor, strength became instinct, movement became control. This physical confidence would later evolve into something revolutionary, but at the time, it was simply how she survived. Her entry into film was not the result of stage school grooming or studio ambition. It happened by accident. At just 12 years old, while playing baseball in the street, she was noticed by director Alan Dwan. He cast her in the 1921 film A Perfect Crime. The opportunity was real, but the road that followed was anything but glamorous. For years, Jane hovered at the margins of Hollywood. Small roles, rejections, studios that signed her, then discarded her within months. The industry showed her little mercy and no loyalty. Then, just before her 19th birthday, catastrophe struck. A car accident shattered a windshield, sending glass into her face. The resulting scars threatened to end her career before it had truly begun. In an era when actresses were expected to embody flawless beauty, any imperfection could be a death sentence. But Jane did not disappear. She adapted. Instead of chasing prestige roles, she threw herself into work that most actresses openly despised, slapstick comedy. Between 1927 and 1929, she appeared in 18 short films for Max Sennett's Keystone Studios. These years would later be dismissed by studio publicity as insignificant. They were anything but. While others saw slapstick as degrading, Jane treated it as brutal training. Keystone demanded absolute physical precision. Timing was everything. Pain was real. Falls were not faked. Mistakes were punished immediately by laughter or silence. She learned how to make choreography look accidental, how to synchronize her entire body to a joke, how to weaponize awkwardness, vulnerability, and chaos into something magnetic. Most importantly, she learned how to command attention without asking for permission. In later interviews, she would call these years the true turning point of her career. Hollywood had not created Carol Lombard yet, but Jane Alice Peters was becoming unstoppable. Do you want me to continue with part 3? The birth of Carol Lombard, the reinvention of her identity, and the moment she conquers Hollywood on her own terms? Part 3, the woman who refused to play safe. By the early 1930 seconds, Jane Alice Peters understood a brutal truth about Hollywood. Talent alone was not enough. Beauty was disposable, and obedience was rewarded far more often than originality. So she did something radical. She erased herself. Jane Alice Peters became Carol Lombard not as an act of vanity, but as a strategic rebirth. The new name carried sharper edges, more rhythm, more modernity. It belonged to a woman who would not wait to be chosen. Yet even with a new identity, Hollywood remained indifferent. Paramount Pictures signed her, tested her, and nearly abandoned her. Early dramatic roles failed to ignite audiences. Studio executives quietly labeled her unreliable, a polite euphemism for unprofitable. Another actress would have softened herself, chased approval, or accepted ornamental roles designed to keep her visible but powerless. Carol Lombard did the opposite. She leaned into chaos. The years she spent at Max Sennett's Keystone Studios, years the industry dismissed as slapstick drudgery, had rewired her instincts. She understood something few others did. Comedy was not about charm. It was about commitment. When Howard Hawks cast her opposite John Barrymore in 20th Century in 1934, he did not want elegance. He wanted danger. Hawks famously told Lombard to stop acting comedy and start living it. When the script called for her character, Lily Garland, to kick Barrymore's Oscar Jaffe, Hawks demanded it be real. No simulation, no restraint. Lombard did not hesitate. She leaned back on the couch, launched her legs upward, and delivered a series of violent kicks directly into Barrymore's torso while screaming at full volume. The soundstage froze. Barrymore, one of the most revered Shakespearean actors of his generation, was momentarily stunned. The scene became legendary, not because it was outrageous, but because it was honest. In that moment, Carol Lombard redefined what female comedy could be. She was not decorative. She was not passive. She was a force of nature who used her body as an instrument of truth. 20th Century did more than revive her career. It ignited a revolution. A new cinematic language emerged, rapid-fire dialogue, social class inversion, romantic combat disguised as humor, female characters who fought, mocked, resisted, and dominated. The genre would later be named screwball comedy, but Carol Lombard was already its purest expression. Where others flirted with physicality, she mastered it. She fidgeted, paced, flailed, adjusted her clothing, and weaponized nervous energy into storytelling. Every movement conveyed inner turbulence. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was accidental. In 1936, her performance in My Man Godfrey crystallized her genius. As Irene Bullock, a wealthy socialite who appeared frivolous but concealed surprising emotional intelligence, Lombard achieved something rare. She made audiences laugh at privilege while still believing in her humanity. The Academy recognized it. It would be her only nomination. By 1937, Carol Lombard made another unprecedented decision. She walked away from the security of a studio contract and became an independent performer. In an industry built on control, this was an act of defiance. The gamble paid off spectacularly. Her income surged to $465,000 per year, more than 5 times the annual salary of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. She was not merely the highest paid actress in Hollywood. She was among the highest paid individuals in the entire United States. Yet Lombard refused to apologize for her success. At a time when the wealthy hid income and resented taxation, she spoke openly and provocatively about paying her share. "I get 13 cents on the dollar," she told reporters, "so I don't think I earn $1. I think I earn 13 cents. And that's fine with me." She framed taxation as civic duty, schools, infrastructure, collective responsibility. President Roosevelt noticed. He sent her a personal letter of commendation, praising her as a model American taxpayer, an extraordinary gesture that would soon carry far greater meaning. Because war was coming, and Carol Lombard was about to become more than a movie star. She was about to become a symbol. Do you want me to continue with part 4? Carol Lombard, Clark Gable, the illusion of the perfect marriage, and the betrayal that set everything in motion? Part 4, the perfect marriage that wasn't. To the public, Carol Lombard and Clark Gable were not merely married. They were a myth. Hollywood called them the perfect couple, the queen of screwball comedy, and the king of masculine charisma. Their romance felt inevitable, cinematic, ordained. When they married in 1939, the union was celebrated as proof that even the most powerful stars could still find something resembling normal happiness. Behind closed doors, the reality was far more fragile. By early 1942, the marriage was unraveling. Clark Gable was at the peak of his power, MGM's most valuable male star, protected by the studio system, insulated from consequence. Carol Lombard, meanwhile, was evolving in a different direction. She was becoming politically vocal, morally uncompromising, and increasingly impatient with illusions. The conflict had a name: Lana Turner. Turner was Gable's co-star in Somewhere I'll Find You, the film he was actively shooting. She spoke openly about the chemistry between them, describing it as electric, undeniable. For Lombard, these were not rumors whispered in tabloids. They were patterns she could see. She had seen them before. During the filming of Honky Tonk in 1941, Lombard's concern over Gable and Turner's closeness became so intense that she began appearing on set repeatedly. The tension grew unbearable. Turner eventually retreated to her trailer to avoid confrontation. By the 12th of January 1942, just 4 days before Lombard's fatal flight, the situation exploded. Biographers describe a vicious argument. Accusations were exchanged. Trust collapsed. The fight was not merely about infidelity. It was about power, neglect, and a growing ideological divide. Lombard was 33 years old and acutely aware of time. In an era that treated female fertility as a countdown clock, she was desperate to have a child. Years of marriage had passed without pregnancy. The fear that she might never become a mother weighed heavily on her. At the same time, she was deeply frustrated by Gable's refusal to meaningfully engage with the war effort. While she raised millions for national defense, he remained safely ensconced at MGM, protected from service by his status and his studio's interests. To Lombard, patriotism was not symbolic, it was active, physical, personal. The morning after the argument, on January 13, Carol Lombard left for Indiana to lead the first war bond drive of the conflict. Clark Gable did not come to the station to see her off. The absence was deliberate. It cut deeply. Lombard's response was as theatrical as it was brutal. Before leaving, she placed a naked mannequin in Gable's bed, a silent, humiliating message. This was what remained: an absence shaped like a body, a simulacrum of intimacy, stripped of warmth. She left knowing the marriage was balanced on a knife's edge. But she also left determined. The Indiana rally on January 15 exceeded every projection. Thousands of Hoosiers gathered at the State House to see their native daughter. Lombard refused to delegate connection. She personally handed receipts to bond purchasers, spoke to them face to face, shook hands for hours. By nightfall, the drive had raised over $2 million in a single day. Before going to bed, she sent Clark Gable a telegram that would later be described as haunting. "Pa, you better get into this army." She intended to return home immediately, not to reconcile, but to confront. She wanted to arrive while her moral authority was undeniable before the triumph faded, before momentum cooled. The original plan was to take the train, days of travel, time for distance, time for hesitation. Carol Lombard did not want time. She wanted resolution, and that urgency would soon collide with fate itself. Do you want me to continue with part 5? The war bond triumph, the coin toss, and the final decision that sealed her fate? Part 5, the coin toss that ended everything. The triumph in Indiana should have been the end of the story. It was not. On the 15th of January, 1942, Carol Lombard had achieved something no Hollywood star had ever done before. In a single day, she raised more than $2 million in war bond pledges, nearly $40 million in today's currency. Thousands of people had waited for hours, not for spectacle, but for proximity. They wanted to look her in the eyes, to shake her hand, to believe that sacrifice meant something. Exhausted but energized, Lombard knew one thing with absolute clarity. She had to get home. The war bond victory had given her moral authority. She intended to confront Clark Gable while that authority was still blazing before the momentum faded, before distance softened resolve. The longer she waited, the more control she would lose. The original plan was simple: train to Los Angeles. Days of travel, predictable, safe. Her mother, Elizabeth Peters, insisted on it. Elizabeth was a devout Bahani believer, deeply engaged with numerology and patterns. That evening, something unsettled her: the dates, the numbers, the feeling. Witnesses later recalled her telling her daughter repeatedly, "Carol, don't take that plane." Otto Winkler, Clark Gable's press agent and best man at their wedding, agreed. He, too, feared flying. Winkler believed he possessed a psychic sense of impending doom. Years earlier, he had become convinced he would die in a car accident, a belief that shaped his life into one of constant caution. To him, the plane represented unnecessary risk. The discussion became heated. Lombard argued urgency, the need to return immediately, the emotional stakes, the confrontation she could no longer postpone. Her mother argued instinct, fear, a sense that something was wrong. No one would yield. Finally, Carol Lombard reached for a solution that reflected her personality, perfectly decisive, theatrical, and rooted in luck. A coin toss. Heads, they would fly. Tails, they would take the train. It was almost playful, almost absurd. Lombard called heads. She always had. The coin spun, landed, heads. The decision was sealed. That evening, at 7 p.m., TWA Flight 3 departed Las Vegas, bound for Burbank. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-3, tail number NC-28382, carrying 19 passengers and a crew of 3. The cockpit was commanded by Captain Wayne C. Williams, a veteran pilot with over 12,000 hours of flight experience, including 3,500 on the DC-3 alone. Nothing about the crew suggested danger. Nothing about the aircraft suggested failure. But buried in paperwork was a fatal error. During flight planning, Williams and his co-pilot had filed a magnetic compass course of 218 degrees. The correct course was 210. 8 degrees in error, small enough to seem insignificant, yet large enough to redirect the aircraft toward rising terrain. Compounding the risk, wartime blackout regulations had extinguished navigational beacons that normally guided pilots through mountain passes. The night sky was moonless. The desert offered no visual reference, At approximately 7:20 p.m., just 13 minutes after takeoff, the DC-3 slammed into an almost vertical cliff face near the summit of Mount Potosi at roughly 8,000 feet. The aircraft was traveling at 185 miles per hour. Both engines were still at full power. The impact was instantaneous. All 22 people aboard were killed immediately: Carol Lombard, her mother Elizabeth Peters, Otto Winkler, and 15 young Army pilots who never reached their training facilities in California. There was no distress call, no survivors. Only silence, fire, and shattered metal on a mountainside. But the story did not end on that cliff. It had only begun to haunt the man waiting in Los Angeles. Do you want me to continue with part 6? Clark Gable's collapse, the ruby earring, and the grief that drove him into the skies over Nazi Germany? Part 6. Grief, guilt, and the sky over Germany. Clark Gable learned of the crash while standing on the MGM lot in Burbank. He was in the middle of filming Somewhere I'll Find You. The irony would later feel unbearable. The set was loud, efficient, indifferent to catastrophe. Then the message arrived. Confusion first, denial immediately after. Planes were late all the time. Mistakes happened. There had to be survivors. There were none. Gable flew to Las Vegas within hours. From there, he traveled toward Mount Potosi, climbing into a night that refused to offer answers. He waited with search parties through darkness and cold, drinking heavily, bargaining with fate for a miracle he already knew would not come. At dawn, the wreckage was reached. There was no ambiguity. The aircraft had struck stone at full power. No one could have lived. When confirmation was delivered, Clark Gable broke. He attempted to climb the mountain toward the debris, driven by a desperate need to reach the place where his wife had died. An MGM handler physically restrained him. Gable collapsed, panting, hollowed, reduced to something smaller than grief. Among the scattered wreckage, searchers found a single, intimate object, one of Carol Lombard's ruby and diamond earrings. Gable kept it. For the rest of his life, he wore that earring on a chain around his neck. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued a declaration that reframed the tragedy for an entire nation. Carol Lombard, he said, was the first woman to be killed in action in the defense of her country during its war against the Axis powers. The Treasury Department echoed the sentiment. She had died for her country. 7 months later, on the 12th of August, 1942, Clark Gable walked into a U.S. Army Air Force's recruitment office and enlisted. He was 41 years old. President Roosevelt personally urged him to stay home, sending a telegram that read simply, "Stay where you are." Gable refused. Biographers would later note that he made no effort to conceal his indifference toward survival. Whether this was patriotism, punishment, or a desire for reunion was never clarified. He trained as an aerial gunner. He flew 5 combat missions over Nazi Germany aboard B-17 Flying Fortresses. Beneath his flight suit, against his chest, rested Carol Lombard's ruby earring. On the 12th of August, 1943, exactly 1 year after his enlistment, a 20-millimeter cannon shell fired by a German Messerschmitt tore through his aircraft's flight deck. It passed so close to Gable that it sheared off the heel of his shoe. An infinitesimal difference in trajectory would have ended his life. It did not. Clark Gable survived the war, but he never recovered. When he died in November 1960, 18 years after Carol Lombard, his will contained a single, unambiguous instruction. He was to be buried beside her at Forest Lawn Memorial Park, not with his second or third wife, but with the woman whose earring had rested against his heart during 5 missions over enemy territory. The woman lost to a coin toss. The woman whose final telegram pushed him into a war he would enter, seeking either redemption through sacrifice or reunion through death. Fate had reduced everything to chance, heads or tails, and history had chosen. Do you want me to continue with part 7? The legacy, the myth, and why Carol Lombard still haunts American memory today? Part 7. The legacy of a woman chosen by chance. Carol Lombard did not live long enough to see the world she helped shape. She did not see the end of the war. She did not see the transformation of Hollywood. She did not see how the genre she embodied would redefine female agency on screen for generations, but her absence became its own presence. In the months following her death, Carol Lombard ceased to be only an actress. She became a symbol of sacrifice, of patriotism, of a woman who did not treat fame as insulation from responsibility. America did not mourn her quietly. It mourned her collectively. Newspapers framed her death not as an accident, but as a consequence of commitment, a life interrupted because she chose to act rather than observe, to participate rather than remain protected. Her image was frozen in time, youthful, fearless, laughing on screen, while the country she loved descended fully into global war. For many Americans, Lombard became proof that the cost of war was not abstract. It had a face, a voice, a future erased by 8 degrees on a compass. In Hollywood, her influence endured in less visible ways. The women who followed actresses who spoke faster, moved bolder, resisted passivity were inheritors of a language Carol Lombard had helped invent. Screwball comedy did not merely entertain. It challenged hierarchies. It allowed women to dominate scenes physically and verbally without apology. That legacy would echo for decades. Clark Gable never publicly recovered from her loss. Though he remarried and continued working, those close to him noted a permanent hardening, a gravity that never lifted. The ruby earring remained against his chest until the day he died, a private relic of grief carried beneath public legend. When he was buried beside her at Forest Lawn, it closed a circle history had left open for 18 years. 2 stars, 1 coin toss, a marriage fractured, then sealed forever by fate. Carol Lombard's story endures because it resists comfort. It reminds us that chance can outweigh intention, that love and betrayal can coexist, that heroism can emerge not from battlefields alone, but from decisions made in exhaustion, urgency, and faith in luck. She did not die because she was careless. She died because she was determined, and that is why, decades later, her story still asks us the same unsettling question. If you knew how fragile the margin was, would you still call heads? And